Mr. Gilspie preferred never to deal with travel agencies when he traveled abroad, which happened quite often, for he was a very wealthy gentleman and adored all sorts of adventures. He invariably planned his own routes, using railway timetables and all sorts of reference books and guides, which were almost his reference books. Unfortunately, it also happened that his plans failed, like this time, for example, when the failure turned out to be completely unexpected. He was traveling in the southern part of Europe and, as luck would have it, got stuck on the road. The taxi, if you could call the hired car that, was standing forlornly at the side of the road, hopelessly stuck in deep mud. The car's engine had long since died, and the bewildered driver kept scratching his head in confusion. Mr. Gilspie once again glanced irritably at his watch. It was 12:30, and if he was serious about getting to Zagreb, he had to be in Munchak no later than 6. He climbed out of the decrepit car and, finding himself under the rays of the bright sun, which had finally appeared in the sky after several days of continuous rain, immediately began to sweat stickily. After all, he was already in his 70s, and besides, his corpulent build was clearly telling. He really wanted to talk to the driver, but he did not know the local language at all. Then Mr. Gilspie pointed his finger at the stalled engine, then pointed to his wristwatch, clearly making it clear that he wanted to know when they could continue their journey. The answer came immediately, not earlier than 2 hours. Mr. Gilspie sighed resignedly and looked around, although there was not much to see. To the left of the road, a dense, dark forest towered like a solid wall, while to the right, a precipice yawned, stretching beyond the cliff. The shade from the trees beckoned with its refreshing coolness, and so the hapless traveler took out of the trunk of the car a travel bag in which he always carried his painting supplies, threw it over his shoulder and was about to leave. To Mr. Gilspie's obvious surprise, the driver began to hold him back with strange fervor, motioning for him to stay put. With a hand damp with sweat, he grabbed his thick wrist and quickly chattered something in his own language, at the same time looking anxiously into the passenger's eyes. Mr. Gilspie involuntarily felt irritated, shook his head and made another unsuccessful attempt to express himself in English. Then he confidently moved towards the forest. The driver shouted something after him again, but he did not even turn around. Soon both the car and the driver disappeared from sight completely. Now he was surrounded on all sides by the forest, a little mysterious, a little eerie, partly friendly and in some ways impersonal. In the end, Mr. Gilspie began to think that the forest was quite benevolent towards him. True, quite soon he noticed its unusual silence. Not even the singing of birds was heard, although this silence rather suggested to him not so much a hidden hostility as a good disposition towards his own person. He also noticed that the forest was still rather strange. There was no undergrowth at all. There were no fallen leaves, branches or other forest debris anywhere. There were no thickets of bramble, only soft, smooth green grass growing between even and orderly rows of trees that seemed to be artificially planted. Mr. Gilspie was not a botanist and therefore had no idea what these trees were called, although their shade did indeed have the most beneficial effect on him. Bright rays of sunlight broke through the dense crown of the trees, falling in uneven yellowish spots on the lush green grass. As an amateur artist, he could not help but appreciate such a pleasing to the eye range of colors. Coming out into a small clearing, Mr. Gilspie found a convenient stump for sitting, which was almost closely adjacent to one of the trees. In this place, the sun's rays falling on the ground had almost no obstacle in front of them from branches and leaves, which made all the colors seem brighter, richer and created a charming play of light and shadow, falling in an even layer on the soft green grass. Mr. Gilspie slowly took a palette and paints from his bag. It was easy and even pleasant for him to work his head slightly thrown back, and obedient fingers deftly moved the brush across the sheet of paper. After a while, he nevertheless vaguely felt that, despite all its natural charm, this whole scene was deprived of some important element. For some reason, he wanted to see a little boy in a red jumper at the base of the tree. Looking slightly to the side, Mr. Gilspie literally jumped up in amazement. There really was a little boy sitting near the tree, calmly looking at him. True, he was not wearing a red sweater, but a rather strange outfit, vaguely resembling a sack with a slit for his head, which barely covered his dirty, thoroughly scratched knees. Otherwise, there was no doubt this was indeed a small boy of flesh and blood. The boy curled his lips, showing his snow-white teeth for a moment, after which he stood up and fearlessly walked towards Mr. Gilspie, stopping a few steps away from him. Slightly lowering his gaze, the artist noticed with disgust that the child was clutching in his palms the bloody remains of some small animal, either caught in a trap or prey to a larger predator. Catching his gaze, the boy grinned again and threw aside the terrible, bloody rags of meat, and then slightly stretched out his lips, threw his head back a little and let out a loud, drawn-out whistle. A moment later, the astonished Mr. Gilspie saw 3 more children emerge from behind the trees, 2 boys and a girl, very similar to the first, dark-skinned, with shining eyes, tousled hair and dressed in the same baggy rags. The children silently looked at the stranger. The first to emerge from the row was a girl approaching Mr. Gilspie. She extended her hand and unexpectedly squeezed his leg just above the knee. Apparently, the result of such an inspection was quite satisfactory to her, since she immediately went over to her friends and said something to them in a quiet voice. They laughed excitedly, opening their mouths wide and flashing their cheerful, shining eyes. Mr. Gilspie was clearly feeling insecure. On the one hand, he felt a certain embarrassment, finding himself under fire from 4 pairs of attentively looking eyes. On the other, he felt obvious annoyance at being unable to talk to them. Instead, he only smiled at them. Their expressions did not change at all. Then he took his unfinished sketch from the easel and showed it to them. Then he suddenly remembered that he had a bar of chocolate in his bag. He quickly unzipped it, took out the delicacy, broke off a small piece and put it in his mouth, in case these poor ragamuffins had never seen anything like it, and handed the rest to the girl. The scene that followed was so wild that Mr. Gilspie stood for some seconds as if struck by lightning, not knowing what he should do. First the girl sniffed the bar of chocolate, bit off a piece and began to chew it intently. At the same moment, the boy sitting next to her snatched the chocolate from her hands. She, naturally, rushed at the offender with a squeal, so that in a few seconds both small bodies were intertwined in a fierce, almost mortal struggle. The children rolled around on the grass. "Stop it!" Mr. Gilspie, who had finally come to his senses, exclaimed sharply. "Stop it right now." It seemed that no one even heard him. The boy continued to squeeze the girl's throat with both hands, while she scratched his face with her nails. Mr. Gilspie could not stand it and, grabbing the boy, abruptly pulled him to his feet, involuntarily amazed at the force with which the child was tearing himself out of his hands. Suddenly he fell silent, somehow went limp, but the girl laughed triumphantly and dexterously jumped to her feet. Then the 4 of them stood around him, clasped their palms, forming a kind of living, dirty brown ring, and, laughing merrily and throwing back their heads, began to run around the astonished man, stamping their bare heels and seeming to involve him in some kind of wild dance. Everything swam before Mr. Gilspie's eyes. He fussed, jerked from side to side, trying to break free from the living ring, but the children's little hands clung to him every now and then and held him firmly in their captivity. At last he managed to break through their encirclement, He immediately sank to the ground, wiping the sweat from his forehead and trying to calm his desperately pounding heart. Meanwhile, the children again formed a semicircle, and, looking at them, Mr. Gilspie involuntarily was amazed at the fact that they seemed not at all out of breath and not even tired, while he still could not catch his breath. At some moment, he again felt a sharp squeeze of his leg just above the knee. This time it was a boy. And again the children exchanged some words. True, now none of them laughed. They all silently and tensely peered into his face. Mr. Gilspie thought that it was time to return to the car. He rose with difficulty, feeling his legs buzzing from the unaccustomed running. The children continued to stand motionless in place. And again the girl came forward, slightly stretching her lips. She stretched out her palms to him, as if hinting that he should take her in his arms and kiss her goodbye. Mr. Gilspie was clearly touched by such a scene. He picked up the child, and the child actually clasped his little arms around his neck. And at the same moment the man felt a disgusting, some kind of animal stench emanating from her unexpectedly opened mouth. Her greenish eyes looked straight into his nose. Suddenly the artist felt a fit of bottomless, chilling horror. With a sharp cry, he tried to free himself from the grip of the children's hands clinging to him. Soon he was already screaming long and wildly, almost howling, while the blonde head continued to bend lower and lower, until her lips reached his throat, and white teeth sank into his soft flesh. And then 3 pairs of tenacious fingers grabbed him by the ankles, jerked him sharply from the unexpected attack. Mr. Gilspie staggered and fell heavily on his back. Now all 4 of them jumped on his chest, stomach, legs. For some time he continued his desperate but useless resistance, even screamed loudly a couple of times, but then he fell completely silent. A few minutes later, all that could be heard on the silent clearing was the abrupt clanking of strong, young teeth.